Thank you all for coming again today for our last class on this topic. It's been very eye-opening and very, I hope for you as well as for Jeannie and me to dig deep into this material. I'll pray to open the session. Heavenly Creator, thank you for the chance to come together today and consider our place in your plan for the world. As spring opens up the ground and opens the flowers, please let that sunshine open a feeling of hope in us as the pandemic moves and shifts and our lives change once again. Please guide us, give us hope, give us faith. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Jim.
Mm-hmm.
So last week, I just thought I'd do a little recap. We focused on the power of God in this. And I thought had a rather in-depth and meaningful conversation to the question, is it possible to trust that the God of the gospel is in, with, and under a crisis without imagining that God is the cause of it? And so hopefully this is bubbling up some memory of last week's conversation. And then we moved into the idea that perhaps disaster can lead to good ends, but it takes work. We talked about this matrix of groan and new birthing and what's being birthed in the world and perhaps Fourth Press. And lastly, we talked about the concept that God will see us through this, but we need to do the work. And so I hope that kind of sets the stage for this week's discussion. And if you can cue the third set of slides. When we first started together, I had Jim play through a YouTube video, a poem by Professor Brugman called Exile. And in that piece, and I left that here in case you ever wanted to Google it again and listen, there was a sense of sort of wandering and being in this space of unknowing and not knowing what to do, knowing that the world has changed and examining the changes that are happening in healthcare, in social, sort of social hierarchy and a whole list of things, but the whole idea of being in exile and wandering. And so I thought that was a nice entree to really looking at the power of prayer, which is one of the main foci that I'd like to talk about today. The power of prayer and how that can lead to transformation and our call to Christian action. So that's the that's the meat of what we'll focus on today, the power of prayer, transformation, and our call to Christian action. So with that background, next slide. I'm going to ask Jim to read one of Professor Brugman's prayers that you can find if you have the text on page 44. It's called The Giver of Bread and Fish. If you don't have the text, just sit back and listen, because I think this is a powerful example of prayer through the lens of this author. And listen for the tone, and if anything jumps out at you as really being perhaps powerful. So I'd like to have just a little discussion after Jim reads it, so we can sit back and listen for a minute.
We do thoughts and prayers easily and glibly. We do thoughts without thinking. We do prayers without praying. We commit that glib act because it is what we know how to do with an anemic God, or because we are embarrassed to do more, or because it is convenient and costs us nothing. Now, however, we are driven to unthinkable thoughts about all that is ending and all we have lost and all that leaves us with a sinking feeling, and all that leaves us with a sinking feeling. Now, however, we are driven, some of us, to unutterable prayers We are driven to such prayer by awareness that our usual reliabilities are gone. We are driven to you, the abiding God, when other helpers fail and comforts flee. Thus we are bold to pray. We are bold to ask because it will be given. So we pray for the end of the virus, for the health of the neighborhood, for the recovery of the economy. We are bold to seek because you will be found. We seek your mercy and your goodness and your generosity. So so let yourself be found by us. We are bold to knock because it will be opened. We know many doors slam shut, doors of health and safety and comfort and fun. Open to us the door of life and love and peace and joy. Here we are in your presence. We ask for bread, the bread of life, the bread of abundance, the bread of neighborly sharing. Do not give us a stone or a crumb. We ask for fish, the fish of a good diet, the fish of your abundant waters, the fish that signs the gospel. Do not give us a snake or the hiss of poison. We dare to pray, not because we are at our wits' end, but because you are at the center of our life. Our hope is in no other save in thee alone. So hear, heal, save, restore. Be the God you have promised to be. Amen.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you. Thoughts, reflections, anything stand out for you from this writing?
I like thinking of unutterable prayers and unthinkable thoughts because very often when we pray, we just sort of think about what's right in front of us and we can't grasp a much bigger question like this because it is unthinkable.
Yes, and we don't have the experience or the context to have pre-formed ideas about something like that in general. Others, yes, thanks, Jim. For me, it comes to the end. We dare to pray not because we are at our wits' end, but because you are the center of our life. There's a thread of all this is just going on, and there are unutterable thoughts and difficulties and all but there's such a courage in his writing and his prayer. We are bold to pray because it will be given. There's such a trust in this, such a faithfulness that it isn't, we're just praying just to say words, but there's a power, the power of prayer that is, for me, it just seems very clear in this writing. How about anybody else?
Building on that, Janine, the paragraph about knock and it will be opened, the spiritual went through my mind that I learned as a kid, too high to go over it, too low to go under it, too wide to go around it. You got to go through the door, and that concrete image of door, and then followed by doors of health, safety, comfort, and fun. Ah, if only.
Yeah.
I just like that image.
Yeah, it's a beautiful imagery, but it reminds me of last week when we talked about that matrix of groan, having to go through this. This isn't something we can just skip over and wake up like and hibernate until next year and it's all gone. So we need to go through this experience. Anyone else?
Also struck by the paragraph you mentioned and that contrast between wits end and center, that when we're stressed and disturbed, we do just tend to zoom off and our minds are floating everywhere, and to find our way back to the center and just quiet down and
Mm-hmm.
hopefully find God there.
Yeah.
I kind of like the back and forth too, that we're bold to do this, but the answer is because you told us we should do this.
Mm-hmm.
You have told us to put you in the center of our lives, so we're going to do it. And it's bold. It's not a supplication. It's a demand is not the word, but it's the standing up and saying, yes, we have arranged our lives this way. Now we're going to do it.
Yeah.
There's kind of a mutuality, like you can go right up face to face and say, listen here, let's have this conversation. What's going on? I mean,
Absolutely.
I missed some of the earlier discussion. My connection wasn't good. So, but it sounds like from what you're talking about, is there an element of, I think about this a lot when it comes to my religious or spiritual feelings, is that there's something bigger than us that just left to, I think the default for most of us, if I can speak for that, is to, be completely ego driven, and it's all about us, and it's all about the thoughts in our minds. And it's hard to open yourself up to other forces, and maybe being reminded of God's presence is a way to train us to think about that it's not just God's presence, but it's a way to kind of, yeah, like I said, train ourselves to think about maybe other people and other circumstances. And it's not just about, if we have thoughts about somebody else, for example, and we think, oh, that's true because that's how we feel. Maybe there's something else at play.
Yeah. That's going to be a common theme as we move through this discussion. So I'm glad you picked up on that, Ira. Anyone else before we move on have any thoughts? Okay. All right, next slide, please. So let's look at other prayer, perhaps in the form of a psalm. I cried out to God for help. I cried out to God to hear me. So this real sense of, I'm either at my wet's end, but I'm reaching out. Don't know what else to do. My soul is in deep anguish. How long, Lord? How long? And I'm wondering how many of us, myself included, have stood in the midst of this pandemic and saying, okay, when is this going to end? Or is there going to be another variant that's going to pop up? And when will that end? Or maybe not. So being in the midst of this, the psalm being another form of prayer, and we'll move into this whole idea of lamentation next. Next slide. So in my prep for this class, it was a great stretch for me. So it's been a wonderful learning for me. Maybe most of you have known this, but for me, I had to really look at how lamentation was defined. So what helped me is a lament is a prayer in pain. That's a uniquely Christian form of prayer that ultimately leads to trust. I thought that was fascinating. So it's someone in absolute pain, but ultimately leads to trust. And that was an interesting formula for me to think about how this might play a role in our current situation. That said, I was a little bit more reading. Tell me what you think about this idea. Preparing people for suffering requires teaching theology. Now, there may be legitimacy to the stages of grief or support groups, but hardship tests what a person believes. And in order to help persevere through seasons of deep sorrow, We need to give them a rich theology that can bear the weight of their pain. What do you think about that? Teaching people or preparing people for suffering requires theology, teaching a theology. What do you think about that?
Be on this earth to constantly prepare ourselves for the horrible end that befalls all of us.
Could be, it could be. And I don't, the horrible end, are you talking about death?
Yeah, the D word.
Ah,
Yes.
well, I'm a hospice nurse, so it's not such a horrible, so it's interesting.
Well,
To
yeah,
look
you
at
have a interesting back or a appropriate background for that. But
yeah, so it's not always horrible. I hope I can let you have that assurance. It doesn't always have to be horrible. But that said, what I found fascinating was using prayer, lamentation, as a form of preparing people for suffering. Has anyone thought of it that way, or is it just an aha moment for me?
The unavoidability of the pain. And you can't have a 90% orientation to it. If the pain is coming, it's going to be fairly all encompassing.
Yeah, yeah.
Like the pandemic is now. It's, if you have really terrible, deep anguish from suffering, it's going to be, it's not a common cold. It's throughout.
Yes, it is.
is there a fine line between complaining and lamenting?
Hmm.
Nobody likes a complainer, but I think that when you incorporate outside of yourself in that equation, it transforms from just complaining
Mhm.
to something deeper, something more transformative,
So
acceptance.
yeah, so the interesting thing that I had been learning is this lamentation. It's permission. It's like it's not considered complaining, but this is a useful tool to just argue with God. And I think at least some people are raised that you should have a stiff upper lip and just believe and everything's going to be just fine. But no, this really gives you the entree, the permission to yell, scream, cry out, and God can take it. God can take, and you're wrestling with these feelings, and it's a unique form of praying that is considered a soliloquy. So it's more about God than God's talking to us. It's us calling out.
I
So,
think when in our class a couple years ago about the Psalms, I forget the name of the teacher, the scholar in the Psalms, and he pointed out that there are three classifications of Psalms. There's Lamentations, there's blessing, and there's supplication or asking God for something. And I think, Jim, you may have been in that, but maybe somebody else was as well. But am I remembering correctly that it was the Lamentations that comprised the bulk of the Psalms?
Yeah, when you read them as a group, yeah.
So it's
The idea of lamentation is you're paying attention to the covenant that God has asked you to join. And if you can complain, and everyone complains, but if you're lamenting, it's like a contractual meeting. It's like we've given you ourselves, and this is what's happening, and that is not right. And you are a God of love, but this is happening. And so I am left with the idea that you are not capable of fulfilling your end of the bargain.
Yeah, like where's the rainbow?
Yeah. It proves it's a deeper understanding of your relationship with, not understanding, but putting a lot of weight and importance on the relationship with God. You're not a casual Sunday goer.
Yeah, this is a daily centering. Yeah. Okay, next slide, please. So a few other examples of, I will never forget this awful time as I grieve over my loss, yet I remember, still dare to hope when I remember this. The faithful love of the Lord never ends. His mercies never cease. Great is his faithfulness. His mercies begin afresh each morning. And so you can see and hear this pain that moves to trust in this form of prayer. And if we can conceive it as one way of moving forward, I think it's a teaching for me on how to pray differently, perhaps. Anyone else have thoughts on lamentations as a form of really sort of strengthening your covenant and being aware of the covenant in your relationship with God? Has that ever crossed your mind, or is this sort of usual thinking?
Well, if we were somewhere in our conversation, the point was we're born to struggle because that gets us somewhere new. And we're testing the waters to discover that God is as far down, is as far down as we can ever go. God will still be there. We're kind of testing that reality. And Brueggemann's notion that we go through disorder to get to a new reordering, and struggle is the means of that transition. And our faith will grow as we discover that God is in the worst of times as well as in the best of times, to use that language.
Yeah. Well said, well said. Thank you. Next slide, please. So it is, one of the metaphors here is in order to have our Easter Sunday, we go through Good Friday. To see the contrast and the beauty of that. And it just reflects, Carol, what you had talked about, needing to go through the struggle. And so this was also a point of discussion, but I like that analogy as well. Next slide. So here we get to this piece of transformation. A few of you have alluded to the transforming aspect of this pandemic and the transforming potential of lamentation. And so using the power of prayer and the grace of God can move us forward and into different and new, who knows, new paths, new horizons. And so let's take some time to think about what that might look and feel like, not only for the church, but for us. Next slide. No, and this is what Jim was talking about. It's an opportunity to renew our covenantal relationship with God. We have, or at least I have, more time to think about this. I'm not in my autopilot self of going from one activity to the next and having my calendar filled from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. When I think about 2 years ago, that's what life was like. And it was numbing. And I honestly don't want to do that again. It was just, it took this, and it's sad to say, to have a different lens, to say that was crazy making. That was absolutely crazy making for me anyway. So has anyone else had that feeling that this time and this space has given you an opportunity to think more about your relationship with God or something more powerful than yourself, isn't it?
As from the aspect of the pandemic itself and the the possibility that it's very much possible that it could happen again in our lifetime, that's been a fairly eye-opening experience. You know, that as we talked about the limits of life on the planet and that kind of thing. That the end might not be the end. The end of this might not be the end of the as it's just not going to wash up and clean up and go away. It's not like it's like watching a movie like Independence Day, when the world is just decimated and everyone's happy at the end and the music swells up and you look around and like, wait, New York just got destroyed, brick by brick. So what's the next step after that? And what do we, if this happens in 20 years again, will we be facing these questions again, and they might be a lot deeper. What if the 20-year-olds of today wake up when they're 40 and this happens again? I think it makes me feel very out of control.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I agree. As things truly do seem to improve and there seems to be light at the end of the tunnel, you're also aware of what could still happen, and how some people are indeed in very different places and thinking differently. And have we in fact learned from this? Can we put those learnings really to work and live them out? Or, is that in fact our responsibility, and we just try to engage more people in that process then?
Yeah.
And when I see something in the news about how adaptable we've all become, adaptable to this change in our lives, I start to think, well, does that mean we're going to adapt to global warming and not change it? Are we just going to allow large portions of the population to suffer and let the rich protect themselves? Is everyone going to get about how adaptable do we have to be, both to our physical world and to each other, until we just say, no, this has to change? Because when it's 9 to 5, or when it's, like you said before, when we're really busy, when it's 7 in the morning till 7 at night, you sort of have to put these things off. You have to put these questions off. Because I'll get to that later. I'll get to the work on racial equity. I'll get to that. I'll get to that in the summer when I have a week off. I'll put some time off to it. And I think the majority of people will be that way, with this adaptable, or when the pandemic is a little bit abated, we'll start to say, well, we beat that, and now it's time to go back and earn money.
Yeah.
Related to that, one of the things this has meant for me this time is to sort through what matters most and what really doesn't matter at all. And then to connect with you, Jim. Okay, now that we've seen the underpinnings, it's like the sock has been turned inside out and we can see what's been in there. What is our role? How do we connect? Which is back to your question. Now that we see more clearly, and then the trust that God is somehow in that trying to show us what we need to see. Now where do we go with that new look, or that new information, or that new vision?
It in some respects, I almost feel like time of lamentation is as much now as it was in the depths of the pandemic, that we've seen more both sides, and now to lift up and try to move toward trust.
Can I ask a question of well, I guess most of us, except for me, maybe Jim too, but what was it like during like the Cuban Missile Crisis? I'd heard that it was a pretty like existential period. Maybe it wasn't long enough to really make a dent, but did people experience like this kind of stuff like we might not be here tomorrow?
I was a little, I was just a couple of years old. So I don't know that answer. Anyone else?
I was 6 or 7, and I remember just this draw to pray, even as a 6 or 7-year-old, because we really didn't know if we would be there the next day. That was certainly something that has formed me as I've developed in my prayer life. I'm just sitting here thinking about how privileged we are to be able to sit and think about our covenantal relationship with God. And what does that mean in terms of how we can give this gift to as many in the world as possible?
Yeah, to frame it as a gift versus something other than a gift. Although it might be a painful delivery, but to see that is a new way of being. Yes, absolutely. Thank you for that. Next slide. So this certainly ties into what we've been talking about. But turning from pain to trust, from pain to trust. It's easy for me sometimes just to wallow in the pain and stay there. But because we still don't know how much. Yes, we're getting vaccinated. I just had my second vaccine on Thursday. I was telling Jim, and all of, that seems hopeful and all of that. But there's something very different about this pandemic, and I've been doing more reading with colleagues and certainly healthcare world, and how it probably won't be 50 years before the next one. Given the global warming, we're much closer to killing off rainforests, things like that have normally protected some species, and now we're much closer to them, whether that be bats or whatever animal that might be harboring various types of coronaviruses. And so the likelihood of this happening sooner than later is more true than not. And so this has just been in the back of my head, is that I can't just sit and live in pain. This really is like being on a boat saying, okay, how do we navigate a new way of being that could be more faithful? Anyone else have thoughts like that? Or
My attitude is we don't know. When I hear you say things like that, Janine, I understand your concern, but I don't put much stock in it just because who knows?
Okay, fair enough, sure.
With all due respect.
No, that
yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you. Fair enough.
Or you can be walking outside and the bus hits you.
Sure, absolutely. Sure, there's all sorts of random things, definitely. And that's sort of being, you go through life and life happens, right? We just don't know when things will happen. But is there a way perhaps to prepare ourselves or just to strengthen ourselves? Do you see this as an opportunity to strengthen your faithfulness?
To relate to Ira and you, what went through my mind is we is all we got. And it makes me more alert to everyday encounters with people. whoever they are, wherever that is, and the quality of those interactions, and to pay attention to who I'm running into. That's something that can occur however, wherever, something like that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Next slide, please. So moving towards this transformative piece as looking at the pandemic as a potential Christian call to action in your life. We talked a little bit last week about witnessing and listening to the stories of others and perhaps in our own life, really paying attention to what's happening, and using this as a time to act. Next slide. So Ira, you had alluded to this earlier, this sense of otherness, moving from self to others. And how do we devise other ways of being human together? You know, is there an opportunity for social change or another way of being a neighbor or being more generous and hospitable to others? These were some of my initial thoughts of perhaps how we can move from typically thinking of ourselves in this and what's happening to me to expanding it to others. So if you can hold on to that thought, do you see opportunities at this point, or have you seen movement in your circle of influence or families where there's more movement from self to others? You know, where are the helpers here? Where have you seen the opportunity for good?
I've had casual acquaintances. I glean from emails between people how many people have volunteered at the COVID vaccination sites who are not medical professionals at all, but they just feel that this has to get done, and they step up for it.
Yes, absolutely. Our dear Judy Watt just is doing that, as a matter of fact, at UI. So it's called the think
And
about.
I hadn't thought of it. I hadn't thought it was available or that people were doing this, but a lot are.
Mm-hmm. Where else are you seeing the movement from self to others?
I mean, I have been fortunate that throughout the past year, I've been able to continue to volunteer with the meals ministry at church. So we, I think we missed one meal over the course of the last year. So our lunches and our dinners and the ability to stay there for our guests and be there for them. And we have been fortunate. We've gotten new volunteers over the time, and we have gotten great donations. So hopefully that will accelerate. We're looking at ways to expand. So it's part of, I guess, the trust and hope.
Yeah, no, that's a beautiful example. Absolutely. Anyone else see this movement from self to others in their world?
I'm drawing a blank.
Okay, that's okay.
Well, it's been hard since we're stuck in isolation, and maybe it doesn't come up in passing conversation, or we don't see it. What can we, up here, what can I do except donate to the food banks?
Mm-hmm.
I know.
But people,
I guess why I'm just saying that because I don't perceive there to be a movement, or it just doesn't, it feels a lot the same, but we're on Zoom and we're not going out and going to big concerts and restaurants and stuff. But other than that, other than that, it doesn't feel all that different
Okay. Mhm.
to me. I don't know. I mean,
Okay.
I'm just not seeing it.
Okay.
Yep.
And you're right. There's no. It may be just within your pockets, perhaps seeds, mustard seeds, that might be emerging that we may not be all aware of.
I mean, I'm not saying I don't see the the people nice to each other and volunteering and donating and whatever. It's out there.
Mhm.
I'm just not seeing it any more or transformatively more now than there was whenever there was a disaster or a need to come together, or some people do it, some people don't. Some people continue to spend their time shopping and doing all sorts of stuff, and including me. And then, some people spend their Sunday mornings doing this. And all sorts of variations thereof.
We're having a friend for dinner tonight, and it's the first time we have had anyone over to do that in a year.
Mhm.
And she's vaccinated, we're vaccinated, we live fairly safe lives. We have some other friends who are also similarly careful, and they're not ready to do that. So the process is going to be really drawn out, I think, in kind of reintegrating our everyday lives. It's not even the volunteering stuff. It's the day-to-day interaction and close
Mhm.
exchanges and
Mhm.
normal.
Yeah.
It's not right there.
Yeah.
Does it sound like a jigsaw puzzle? There are pieces here and there, but we don't know what the final.
Yeah.
Our national politics is shifting for a while, depending on what your politics are. There's hope there, perhaps. Certainly, I've focused on who matters most to me, and many friendships have deepened, and we've been able to express our affection for one another and are kind of going back through our life and our memories together. I've been able to follow my calling in ways that I never would have guessed because of all the technology, which makes me crazy.
Mhm. Mhm.
It's
Yeah.
bits and pieces, perhaps like you're saying, Ira.
Yeah.
You just keep moving. And my nephew, I've gotten to know because as I was mending for my knee surgery, he would get groceries for me and get me to appointments. And I've treasured those times because we didn't have time together when he was a kid. So bits and pieces.
Mhm. And to be grateful for those bits and pieces, I think, is one way to reflect on that. I think the other thing that makes it challenging, at least for me, is like it feels like things might be a little more positive, and then the media and TV is overflooded with horrible events like the massacre or the shootings in Atlanta, and that seems to absorb what's happening because there's horrible events, so you get inundated rightly so, by these horrible things that happen, and it's hard to come back up for air sometimes.
The Pope goes to Iran to try to increase religious tolerance, and he comes back and gays sinful so they can be blessed in their union. And it's like we go forward and backward, forward and backward. I mean, again,
Yeah.
all think alike, but that certainly was distressing to me.
Yeah, how about
That
it?
point of view.
Right. Yeah, no, it's hard to keep up the momentum, so I think we're kind of feeling that same lament. Next slide, please. So we started this conversation, but I want to focus, has this pandemic encouraged you to listen, witness, or act as your Christian call to action? So instead of focusing on others, let's reel it a little bit more in on our own personal changes. Is there something that you've been encouraged to do differently?
I think maybe things that are tangential, but arose from the pandemic were the Black Lives Matter and those types of things. People under stress reacted very clearly, and as I am learning more and more about it, I feel more and more called to address those questions. To not, it's not someone else's problem.
Yes.
And maybe that only could have come up in a pandemic. But and when you're stuck at home in the pandemic, it's you think about these things. They're facing you as you turn on the news every day.
Yeah. Anyone else feel as if they've thinking about or listening differently as your Christian call to action?
I think one thing that's coming up for me is that I take less for granted those brief, fleeting interactions that people have that can seem pretty trivial, or could have seemed pretty trivial, but now seem pretty valuable. And the example I'm thinking of is like work meetings, conferences, things like that, where, like in normal times, you'd walk down the hall, you'd see somebody, hey, how you doing? Oh, good to see you. Maybe a quick shake of the hand, and then you move on. And before, I think in the before times, it was just like, yeah, that's nice, but it's pretty fleeting and whatever. And now it just seems so like there's a connection there. So I've been trying, without bugging people too much, but in things like this, I'll put something in the chat just to them, like, hey, how you doing? Something like that. Just try to recreate some of that. And I guess my sense is that people like being acknowledged, and people, and it doesn't have to be a whole conversation or whatever, just that brief thing. And I'll try to keep that in mind in the future, that those connections are good.
Yeah.
Like, hello, I see you. You really are in the world.
I see you. Yeah, you are the world. Yeah.
All of us wonder, hello, I see you.
Yes.
Yep.
And back to Allison and Jim, the privileges we have are certainly been outlined, brought into great relief during this time. How some of us got vaccines, they just showed up because the hospital called and said, come.
Yep.
And
Yep.
other people are struggling to get them. And Allison, made that point. What do we do while we've seen that?
Sylvia, it looked like you were going to say something.
It's made me feel very aware of my responsibility as a Christian to see hope and express that when talking to people who are in despair. Because I have this gift, I want others to have a chance to see how it can give them hope rather than me participating in the despair with them. I don't know if that makes any
it's beautiful. I almost feel like you've peeked in on a slide in a couple slides.
Okay.
But that's exactly a message that I think is a responsibility, perhaps, of a Christian call to action, and being that light to others. That's one way of thinking about this. Anyone else?
I don't want to suggest I do it all the time.
No, hey, if it once, whoop, once in a
easy
while,
to do
blink,
it.
it's hard work. This is not easy stuff. Absolutely.
And it's possible at this time, we know that we will hit limitations in ourselves, in our energy and our focus. And people are saying, do you just feel like you're working at half capacity in your brain right now? Say, yes, I do. And you realize there are external reasons for that.
Mhm.
And that we are all limited, even to our best intentions might not be good enough, but we know there are reasons for that.
Yes.
And we know that we can, we have come up against our own limitations and still go on.
And give each other a little more grace, right? When can't finish that deadline or whatever
Yeah.
it may be.
I'm perceiving a lot of that in my work environment, that people are just really trying to be patient. And I think in being patient with ourselves, I mean, if you don't, if my mantra these days is that to myself, I'm going to get, one good thing done today that makes a difference.
Mhm.
And if I spend other time loading the dishwasher or doing whatever, it's like, I got a kick out of when Nancy Pelosi was talking about when she was put on hold for 25 minutes from Mitch McConnell.
Uh-huh.
And they said, well, what were you doing? Was it annoying? She's like, nah, I was just like, doing my laundry and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, yeah, it's okay.
Yeah,
Nancy Pelosi could do her laundry while she's on hold.
exactly. The sense of having it good enough
Yeah.
versus
Yeah.
perfect or excellence. And so good enough, progress, not perfection.
I think I have an idea of people's personal social webs a little bit better. As we've sat here and thought, well, who has been exposed here, or who's the apartments that have 3 generations in them, and where do those people go? And I was a little bit aware of that, but now it's kind of in front of your mind. It's like, where does so-and-so live? Where does he or she move in that? And who are they responsible for? And that kind of thing. And that comes up in every news story of someone who's infected or who recovers. And I even feel that watching the volunteers on television at the vaccination sites. It's like they have people they're responsible for. They have people they live with, and they are okay with putting themselves on the line for it a little bit. So there's less atomization. It's more of a big web of people going out.
Yeah.
Just perceptibly.
Yeah, because I think about it, and we had been in a world that was in some respects increasingly individualized. We had our own little things and stuff, and this has been a mass experience. We may go through it differently, but we have all been through the same thing, which just doesn't happen anymore. And so I think that helps getting perspective into other people's lives and patience and understanding.
Absolutely. Okay. Next slide, please. So we've been thinking lots of complex thoughts. Not easy to move through this. It's like wading through molasses with not a lot of definitive answers, living in that ambiguity. Right? So has any of the learnings at this point, as we move towards wrapping up, have you found helpful in your spiritual health to think about things differently? That has perhaps helped you, for example, Sylvia, to be that beacon, to be that light, even once in a while? Is there anything that you could take from what you gleaned to perhaps help others?
I was sitting at the doctor's office earlier this week, and as I was finishing the book, I came across the poem that Jim read earlier today, and it just washed over me. And now you had this sense of care and peace. And so I'll be taking that with me many, many places in the future. So thank you.
Oh, beautiful, beautiful.
I don't know about you guys, but I feel like I could be much more relaxed and present in a group like this on Zoom than rushing out the door. I mean, I know we're going to get back together, and I know there's going to be that in-person community, but I, I just hope we can figure out ways to keep stuff like this going, because it's just so much more convenient and it works. To me, it works. I don't know. Other people might get freaked out by it, or if you spend too much time on Zoom, then maybe it's not good. But
Okay. Yeah.
I have to say, I have appreciated this class because of its smaller, more intimate scales. I do struggle with, you know, the screen full Zooms and then flying off into breakout groups. That's difficult for me. This is much easier to, you know, feel really engaged and present.
That's good to know. That's great feedback. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, to have these more intimate, I agree, even teaching on this in this way.
One thing
yeah,
that's
Janine, I'm sorry, go ahead, Carol.
the question, or the devising new ways to be human together stays with me, and that seems to be reflected in some of our conversation about Zooming. But because of my vocation, it is sending me back to formulate being present and in worship and think of the act of preaching in new ways. That's my growing edge. I've been part of a preaching rotation at the Clare before the pandemic hit, and I'm going to start back there. And all of what's happened in this year and in the courses that I've been part of, helping or being participant, has sent me back to the drawing board.
Okay.
How do I be human with others in that act? I don't know the answer.
No. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks to you.
That's been your learning. Okay. And Ira, you wanted to say something?
No, I was just going to say, Janine, I mean, it's tough material, and you really distilled the essence of things for us. I appreciate that.
Thank you. I have a partner, Jim Garner. We have a little bit of a hybrid here. So thank you, Jim.
Well, Jim knows I ignore him all the time. So.
But
That I was a what? A hybrid?
we're working on this together.
Could you do us or me or us a favor? And I Googled Walter Brueggemann exile poem, and I couldn't find a precise, like, is it part of like a longer video, or is it just?
No, it's just if you go exile YouTube, just YouTube.
Yeah.
And then if you Google exile, if not, we can certainly send you the link.
Yeah, I can find it once we get out of the PowerPoint.
Yeah.
I'll find the link.
All right.
It's queued up, ready to go.
All right. Perhaps.
Oh, here I got it. Yeah, I'll put. I couldn't find one that was shorter, but this is a minute and a half, so I will. I can put it in the chat.
All right. Next slide. We're going to move towards close here. So Sylvia, this is the opportunity to give others a reason to hope. See, I think you were just peeking at my slide somehow. So others need to see our walk, not just our talk, and to see our faithfulness. And that's helpful. That really is. When we can't do it ourselves, when we don't have faith alone to rely on others. We talk a lot about that in Stephen ministry, but this is another living example. Next slide. So I thought we could end with, I thought was just a wonderful transformative experience through a poem, The Hill We Climb by Amanda Gordon. I don't know if you had the opportunity to hear that live version, but I wanted to cap off our conversation together with this. But one thing is certain, if we merge mercy with might and might with right, then love becomes our legacy and change, our children's birthright. When day comes, we step out of the shade of flame and unafraid. The new dawn blooms as we free it, for there is always light if only we're brave enough to see it, if only we're brave enough to be it. Next slide. Hallelujah. Amen. So I just want to thank all of you. Maybe I'm just biased, but I've just had a thrilling experience with, and you get to meet all of you. And thank you. Thank you.
To you.
You.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Jeannie.
Really wonderful.
Yes.